to introduce our speaker for today, Anthony C. Siracusa. So here's a few things you need to know about Anthony. He is a hardcore native-born Memphian. Hardcore native-born Memphian. He has risked his life on the right lane of Poplar Avenue more than most. He's the founder and executive director of Revolution's Community Bicycle Shop from 2002 to 2009. Just a little background to get up to the really good stuff. Many of you might know he's a graduate of Rhodes College, cum laude honors in history. He wrote an amazing thesis when he was here, developing an American ahimsa, the Reverend James M. Lawson's paradigm of protest. I bring that up because, well, here it is, right? Honors thesis, master's thesis, doctoral dissertation, book. This is what Anthony does. He was a Bonner Scholar while he was here. He was a member of the Rhodes, he was a fellow in the Rhodes Institute for Regional Studies way back in 1975. No, way back in 2007. He won a number of awards while he was here in Memphis. Memphis State 8 Paper Prize of the University of Memphis. He was in Who's Who of Memphis back in 2011. Top 20 Memphians under 30, Memphis Flyer 2010. Anthony is very, very fancy. He was a community service coordinator at Rhodes for a couple of years, and then he went off to Vanderbilt and pursued his doctorate in history, which he earned in 2017. Again, building on the work that he began at Rhodes College. He did a number of really interesting things after Vanderbilt. He worked at Colorado College for a couple of years, a senior director of inclusive cultures at the University of Colorado at Boulder. And he is currently in his second year as an assistant professor of history at St. John Fisher University in Rochester, New York. And so I say all of that to say this. Anthony brings a blazing heart, a sharp intellect, and powerful prose, and a historian's eye to the endeavor that is this book. Everything that took place in Anthony's life before this book helped to shape this book. And this isn't really something that happens a lot or frequently for historians and other academics, right? To live a life that simultaneously shapes in really sort of powerful and dramatic and intimate ways that shapes the trajectory of your research, right? But that's the case with Brother Siracusa. So one of the reviews of Nonviolence Before King, his book, The Politics of Being and the Black Freedom Struggle. Siracusa, this is the review. Siracusa has undertaken a remarkably rich excavation of the evolution of nonviolent thought in the decades leading up to the modern civil rights movement and Dr. Martin Luther King. As deftly demonstrated here, the genealogy of nonviolent thought in the context of the Black freedom movements has deep roots. Through thoughtful, sharp analysis and archival work, this history provides an important complement to the expansive corpus of scholarship on the civil rights and nonviolence movement. Right? Those are powerful, powerful words from Jeffrey Ogbar, a professor of history at the University of Connecticut, who kind of knows what he's talking about. Right? He's a brilliant historian in his own right. And so again, I want to emphasize that this book is as good as it is. The insights in this book are as insightful as they are, because of the cultural, political, and intellectual odyssey that Anthony C. Siracusa has taken from his first days in Memphis to this point right here. This book is amazing because Anthony Siracusa is amazing. And so without further ado, Anthony C. Siracusa.
There's a beautiful bit of poetry here because I remember sitting in this exact theater and listening to Dr. Charles W. McKinney Jr. give a talk about his book, Greater Freedom, about Wilson, North Carolina and the freedom struggle there. So how wonderful it is to be back in this space, in the same spot, to be able to share some information from my own research with you. I also have to say, I think the most important thing in the world is to know that you're loved. And when I look around this room, I have to say thank you to so many of you because you have made me feel that way for so many decades and so many years. So thank you. I think that's all really any of us ever wants, is to know that we're loved in this world. So thank you. I so appreciate you being here today. So, how did nonviolence come to stand at the center of the Black freedom movement in the 1950s and 1960s? After all, as the Black Power advocate Eldridge Cleaver put it, violence is American as apple pie. And for black people in America, times of war, organized state violence, these have led to significant advancements for black life. This creates a major historical problem, one of those things that we historians really care about. On the one hand, nonviolence has been associated with the civil rights movement specifically and the longer black freedom struggle from 1619 to the present more generally. And this is true in our popular imagination as well as in the scholarly literature until recently. And I will talk a bit more about that in a moment. So what do we do with that? Violence has in a very real way led to clear, specific, measurable advancements for black life in the United States, and yet nonviolence is at the very center of what we think about when we think about the black freedom movement. What I want to show today is that when we talk about nonviolence, until recently, we haven't really known what we're talking about. And the book that I wrote was here to try and answer that question. And so when I talk about nonviolence today, what I mean is a religious philosophy with massive political implications. I want to talk about how that religious philosophy comes to stand at the center of what is one of the most, if not the most important political movement in the history of the United States. So to begin, let's go back to the beginning. Crispus Attucks, a black soldier, the first casualty reportedly in the U.S. War for Independence. Literally from the first shots fired in the effort to build a new republic, black people were on the front lines. During the Civil War, black Americans transformed this Civil War from an effort to preserve the Union into a war for liberation, with as many as 250,000 black soldiers fighting along their Union counterparts, their Union compatriots, to end enslavement. And some people have made the case, I think persuasively, that without those black soldiers, the Union may not have won the Civil War. I see Dr. Tim Hubner in the room here, right? So we can ask him about that later. Despite fighting in segregated units in the Spanish-American War, the so-called Buffalo Soldiers battled alongside future President Teddy Roosevelt as they scaled San Juan Hill in Cuba. After the battle at San Juan Hill, Rough Rider Frank Knox remembered, "I never saw braver men anywhere." And in this war, for the first time, we start to see black officers enlisted in the U.S. military, a meaningful and visible step towards equality in the United States. During the Second World War, black Americans turned the battle into a battle against fascism abroad, Nazism, and fascism at home, Jim Crow. 2 V's for victory, 2 V's for freedom, at home and abroad. A. Philip Randolph, founder of the first major black trade union, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. He was on the front lines of this double victory campaign, threatening a march on Washington in 1941 unless Franklin Delano Roosevelt desegregated military contractors, which he ultimately did. And in 1948, President Harry Truman, himself a Southerner, becomes the first to desegregate a major American institution, the U.S. Armed Forces. So it is clear that throughout wartime, throughout our country's history, black advancement has taken place, from the Revolutionary War through to the Second World War. Wars opened economic opportunities, enabled black Americans to show their bravery and love of country on the battlefield, and we should not forget, they were also trained, black soldiers, in how to use guns. So like Americans more broadly, black Americans were advocates of armed self-defense. And as we will see, some returning black veterans used that military experience to defend themselves, their families, their communities against white terror violence. But black Americans have also, at various points, utilized revolutionary violence to fight for freedom. Before the United States was a nation, in 1739, nearly 100 enslaved Africans in the South Carolina colony banded together, took up arms, and were set about on freeing themselves, killing any white people that interfered. Following the Stono Rebellion, severe restrictions on African Americans' ability to assemble and communicate would follow. August 1831, Nat Turner, an enslaved preacher, gathered more than 30 enslaved allies and set about collecting weapons to engage in an act of revolutionary violence to free themselves and their enslaved brothers and sisters. They would kill any white person that interfered, and more than 55 white people were killed by Turner and his ad hoc team before they were halted by a white militia. 1859, white anti-slavery advocate John Brown and more than a dozen enslaved allies take over the federal armory at Harper's Ferry. Like Nat Turner, they hoped to gather momentum, build enslaved allies as they went from town to town, place to place, and ultimately free the enslaved people in this country. So, in addition to the organized violence of war, revolutionary violence was common throughout African American and American history, particularly to end slavery in the 19th century. Additionally, armed self-defense was a staple of black life in the decades leading up to the civil rights movement. Facing the violence of lynching and routine white terror, many black Americans used guns to protect themselves and their families, including Ida B. Wells, one of our most famous Memphians. She declared in 1898, a Winchester rifle should have a place of honor in every black home. She would know. Wells was run out of town when a white mob burned down her newspaper building here in Memphis in 1898 after she exposed the truth about lynching, that white women were often lying about being raped by black men. W.E.B. Du Bois proclaimed that if any whites sought to do him harm, he would, quote, spray their guts all over the grass. This was following the lynching of Sam Hose in Atlanta in 1899. This particularly brutal and very public lynching led to Mr. Hose's knuckles being on display in a local white butcher shop, available to anyone willing to pay. When Robert F. Williams came back from the Second World War, he was clear. I learned from the U.S. Army how to fight for freedom, and I will defend my community using the skills I learned as a soldier in the U.S. Army. In Monroe, North Carolina, Williams and other black veterans organized an armed blockade to stop the Ku Klux Klan from terrorizing their neighborhood. These are but a few examples, but the implication at this point should be clear. The organized violence of war, revolutionary violence, armed self-defense, these have long been staples of the long struggle for black freedom in the United States. And don't just take it from me. These are some of the most important books that have come out in the field over the last 5 to 10 years. We Refuse just came out this past year, a forceful history of black resistance from our colleague Kelly Carter Jackson. We Will Shoot Back, armed resistance in the black freedom movement in Mississippi. Negroes and the Gun, the black tradition of arms, right? We have more literature on this now such that we can talk about a thing called the black tradition of arms. And then finally, this nonviolent stuff will get you killed. How guns made the civil rights movement possible. So the question is a tough one. How did nonviolence come to be a powerful force for black liberation in the 1950s and 1960s? Let me start with this individual right here, Charlie Cobb, a veteran of the freedom movement, deeply active in SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He was a participant in the Mississippi Freedom Summer of 1964, and he wrote that book, This Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed. So imagine my surprise when I start reading this book closely and see he actually has an arrow pointing us towards understanding why nonviolence is so important and how it came to be at the center of the movement. This is what he says. He says, I have never subscribed to nonviolence as a way of life, simply because I have never felt strong enough or courageous enough, even though as a young activist and organizer in the South, I was committed to the tactic. But, he says, facing routine violence, watching friends of his be killed for their activities in the freedom movement, Charlie Cobb says this, if faced with the prospect of having to shoot somebody who was coming after me, my family, or my friends, I would have been able to live with the burden of having killed a man to save my own life or those of my friends and coworkers. He says, but there has been a challenge to reconcile that fact with nonviolence, the chosen tactic of the Southern civil rights movement of which I was a part. More than ever, Cobb says, what we need is an exploration of this contradiction. The subject of guns, of armed self-defense, they've never been more politicized or more hotly debated than they are today. And although it may seem peculiar for a book largely about armed self-defense, I hope these pages have pushed forward discussion of both the philosophy and the practicalities of nonviolence, particularly as it pertains to black history and struggle. So to be clear, in a book about black armed resistance, Cobb is saying we need a deeper exploration of nonviolence. Why? Because we have not done a good enough job understanding what we mean when we say the philosophy of nonviolence. People adopted nonviolence as a way of life. What does that mean? Again, Charlie Cobb can help us here. Cobb says that the real power and authority of the Southern Freedom Movement came from sustained courage at the grassroots level. Sustained courage. It was sustained courage that led to the massive legal victories in the movement. The 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act, the 1968 Fair Housing Act, sometimes called the Second Civil Rights Act. Why? Because those pieces of legislation were brought forward by massive grassroots nonviolent mobilization in cities, towns, counties, and states across the former Confederacy. We know about the Birmingham campaign, where children faced off with fire hoses and dogs. We know about the Selma March, where John Lewis was beat unconscious as he tried to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge. But were the fruits of those victories, those pieces of legislation? Listen to what I'm saying now. Were the fruits of those victories those pieces of legislation? Or was there something else that was happening when those individuals took courageous nonviolent action, knowing full well that that could be their last day on this earth, that they would do anything? Is there something that is maybe even more important than those signature pieces of legislation? Again, let's turn to Charlie Cobb. What does Cobb say about his role in the freedom movement and his chosen tactic of nonviolence? He said, in practicing sustained courage, we won our self-respect. It changed my attitude. This movement made me demand a semblance of first-class citizenship. Sustained courage. The courage to live as a first-class citizen in a society that required you to act, in fact, like a second-class citizen, and let's be clear, under the penalty of death. When a person makes up their mind to live from the truth that they are somebody, that they deserve respect, that they will not bow and bend and scrape regardless of the consequences, even if those consequences be death, that kind of stuff changes a person. Because there are some things worse than death. To live a lie, to act as if you don't matter, to participate in a charade that makes one small, humiliated, degraded, beaten down. What kind of life is that? The politics of being were about standing up for yourself. It was about choosing to be free. And it was about saying, damn the consequences, because I will stand upright. As King reminded us, a man can't ride you if your back is not bent. It was about speaking clearly and truly through your own life, not letting the demands of Jim Crow shape your identity, but instead living your truth as a human being endowed by your Creator with infinite capacities for creativity, love, and compassion. And the fact that you have to make that choice in the face of certain violence and possibly death, that is what makes that a political choice. You understand what I'm saying? If a whole bunch of us then decide we're going to do that together, well, shoot, now you're talking about a force that could be powerful enough to end American apartheid. Sustained courage in the face of perhaps certain violence and likely death. What does that take? How do you get there? I can remember being a young person and going to the National Civil Rights Museum where they have this very bus. I think it's still there to this day, Russ. That was blown up in Anniston, Alabama in May of 1961. When the initial Freedom Riders jumped on that bus, they knew there could be perilous consequences. But I don't know if they quite understood that something like this would happen. The Klan bombs the bus in Anniston, Alabama. Many of the Freedom Riders are severely hurt, cannot go on, and others simply will not go on. In that moment, there were a set of students from Nashville, Tennessee, who looked at one another and they said, we cannot allow violence to stop this movement. If we do not pick up the freedom rides, if we allow the Klan to turn us around now, we will never be able to push forward. So 18, 19, 20-year-old young people, like the students who attend this college, created their wills, signed them, gave them to their parents, and said, we might not come back from this, but we have to do it anyway. When these Nashville children, as David Halberstam called them, because they were children, barely 18 years old, decided that they had to move forward, that they had to keep the hope of nonviolence alive, they did it because they said, this is about something more than my own life. This is about something bigger than me. It was about an ethical ideal, something that transcended their own lives, but which they were deeply involved in carrying forwards. How do you get to a point where you make that kind of choice? The great philosopher, Chuck D. Yes, that Chuck D. The lead MC for the hip-hop group Public Enemy. He said, when I was born, I had Negro on my birth certificate. My identity was politicized before I was born, with no choice on my part at all. So for all you folks who are calling me a political rapper, this is just me telling you about my life, how I am navigating this racialized world as a person with a target on my back. Literally, that is the logo for Public Enemy. So just telling the truth, just telling my story, that becomes a political act when you're a black MC growing up in a racial apartheid society in one of the poorest areas of the country. Even the simplest act, telling your story, becomes political because of the world we are born into. This is fundamentally what the politics of being are all about. Speaking your truth through your life. And in the process, you crash into the rigid and sharp boundaries of a racial hierarchy that has not made room for your truth. In a Jim Crow world, the choice about where to sit, can't do it here if you're black. The choice about pursuing your dreams, getting an education, building a life for yourself, can't go to this school, not if you're black. The ability to decide who you'd like to marry, where you would like to live. Can't marry this person if you're black, literally against the law. These are fundamental choices about existing in the world. So let me be super clear right now. When I talk about the politics of being, I am not talking about black reactions to a white world. I am talking about black people making the choice to live as free people in a world violently racialized and segregated by a white majority that forcefully imposed its will upon a black minority. That's not a reaction. It's literally just trying to be. Recognizing the political implications of those choices and turning those choices into a collective action that ultimately transformed our country. In the historical context of Jim Crow America, everyday survival, simply being, was a challenge. But what about that thing that is even greater than your own life and survival? What about that ideal that Diane Nash and others had in mind? That thing that should live beyond their own lives, that should transcend their own existence, to carry forward, to push down walls for future generations. What about that thing? And this is where we get to the heart of the philosophy of nonviolence in the black freedom struggle. What do we say to the person with their back against the wall? To fight back is impossible. The United States has the most sophisticated and powerful military apparatus in the history of human civilization. To flee might well be impossible for many as well. You just going to go? Where are you going to go? How are you going to get there? Your back is against the wall. What is the word that comes to people in that situation? This is what Howard Thurman, perhaps the greatest religious thinker of the 20th century, I said it, called the problem of creative survival for a disinherited minority. Thurman said the situation facing African Americans in the 20th century was very similar to the situation facing a Nazarene carpenter in first century Palestine. Your most basic decisions, a decision, for example, to live and practice your religious ideals as a Jewish person, a religious minority in the Roman Empire, Even your simplest choices had profound political implications. And in fact, those choices might lead to your death. Bayard Rustin, a 20th century black activist, knew this better than most. He was a gay black man fighting hard for civil rights in the 1930s and 1940s. And he understood well how his most personal choices could lead to severe consequences. In most cases during this time period, homosexual acts of love were forbidden by law. Rustin became one of the most effective teachers of nonviolence as a powerful force for social transformation. And he did this in the 1940s, I argue, because he understood well the deeply political nature of his most private and personal choices. He began to see how acting in accord with his most deeply held belief to be free could become a politics of challenge to white supremacy and Jim Crow if we could figure out how to bring more people into this idea, to practice it collectively. Unlike many of his ancestors we discussed earlier, Rustin refused to fight in the Second World War, and his reasoning was simple. Jesus says, I cannot kill other people, so I cannot fight in this war. So he goes to jail rather than fight the Nazis in Europe. And once he was in prison, he was, of course, in a segregated facility. And this is one of the things I love about Bayard Rustin as much as anything. He said, I am not going to abide by segregation in this jail. And so he begins to undertake nonviolent direct action campaigns in the jail to try to desegregate the prison facility. You want to talk about courage. He spent 26 months in federal penitentiaries, making that good trouble. 2.5 years, more or less, amid what many of us call the good war. Pauli Murray, she knew about these choices as well. She was a young woman who, growing up, did not feel comfortable in the body she was born into. She felt deep down more like a man, like a male, and she struggled to live into the female requirements of dress and decorum that were so pervasive in the 30s and 40s. So she began to dress and fashion herself in male styles, beginning in the 1930s. She called this persona the dude. And when she and a friend decided to challenge the racial segregation laws on a Virginia bus in 1941, the NAACP, alerted to the cause, said, we're not taking up your case. Why? Great opportunity to challenge racial segregation laws. It's exactly what the NAACP is looking for. Why did they not choose to take up her case? Because when she was arrested, she was dressed like a boy. That's not the case that we can use, said the NAACP. When she becomes a student at Howard University in the 1940s, while Howard Thurman is a professor of religion there, she said, I can't stand the fact we can't go down to Washington, D.C. and enjoy some of the best restaurants this city has to offer. So she organized Howard students to begin sit-down campaigns in Washington, D.C. in 1942, decades before the sit-in movement swept over the country in 1960. It is no accident that these individuals, Bayard Rustin and Pauli Murray, became early adopters and advocates of nonviolence. In the 1930s, the 1940s, they knew their most fundamental personal choices had steep political implications. The structures of oppression that greeted them in this world were well established and fully operational before they were born. And their inability to live freely, to feel a sense of home in their own bodies, in their minds, in their spirits, in this world, that was something they were forced to deal with very early on in their lives. These individuals did not grow up wanting to be activists. They became activists because their most simple choices became political in a world where systems of racial, gender, and sex-based oppression were fully operational. Diane Nash, among the students in Nashville in that early 1960s sit-in movement, she was one who decided to pick up those freedom rides in 1961. For her efforts, they were, of course, arrested, driven through the state of Mississippi, and deposited at Mississippi's infamous Parchman Penitentiary. She was pregnant, 5 months pregnant. And she said, I was scared the whole time. But here's the thing. You had to do what was required, or you had to tolerate segregation. And whenever I obeyed a segregation law, I felt like I was agreeing that I was too inferior to do what the general population did. Diane Nash, Bernard Lafayette, John Lewis, James Bevel, the list goes on. Many other students, they studied this philosophy of nonviolence alongside this man here, the Reverend James M. Lawson Jr. I've given a lot of talks. Many of you know I've thought a lot about Reverend Lawson for many, many years. We lost him this year. 93 years old. I had the opportunity as a student at Rhodes in the Rhodes Institute to talk to Reverend Lawson. And this is what he told me back in 2007. Howard Thurman, in his 1949 book, Jesus and the Disinherited, he said, "The gospel is a toolkit of survival for those whose backs are against the wall. You may not have any control over the hostility, but Jesus did teach you that you have control over the way you respond to it. You do not need to respond with an eye for an eye. You could make a choice. You could make a decision. You have the power of that choice, not to imitate the evil, the hostility." Thurman says, the anger, fear, deception, and hatred, these are the four hounds of hell, often nipping at the heels of the oppressed. But Lawson knew, he learned through his own time in a federal penitentiary resisting the Korean War, that if you could master your fear, if you could master your anger, if you could move past the deception, and I'll talk more about that in a minute, that you could open up space within yourself for a profound act of courage that allowed for creativity rather than reactivity. You always have that choice, he taught his students. You always have that choice. So in my last few minutes, I just want to talk a little bit about this idea of deception, which Reverend Lawson pointed to. This comes directly from Howard Thurman in his 1949 book, which is for sure the most important book in understanding this philosophy of nonviolence. Let me say this before I get into this. I first started reading this book with Dr. Luther Ivory when I did my honors thesis and was preparing for that work. Dr. McKinney turned us on to it initially. And then I said, I don't think I really understand this book. There's no talk about boycotts. There's no talk about pickets. There's no talk about direct action in this book. What does this have to do with nonviolence? And I'll be honest with you, as I wrote the book and got on the other side of my own doctoral work, it became clear as I started to teach this book that I still did not really understand it. And so what I'm going to try to do today is I'm going to try to explain what I think is the most important and hardest to understand part of this, which is this idea of deception. This is what I want to talk about in my last few minutes. Lest you doubt the importance of this text, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. carried this book with him everywhere when he traveled around the South. And in fact, it was in his briefcase the night he was killed in Memphis. Like me, I think Dr. King tried to understand this book throughout his whole life, right? It's a puzzle that continually sort of unfolds itself for you. 100 pages, it's not very long. And Jesus is the case study. This is what Howard Thurman says. He says, the Negro feels, this is his language from the 1940s, that he must be prepared at a moment's notice to protect his own life and take the consequence therefore. Living in a climate of deep insecurity, Jesus, similarly, faced so narrow a margin of civil guarantees that he had to find some other basis upon which to establish a sense of well-being. Long and short of it, the state will not protect you. As Charles Payne and Dr. McKinney and others have asked, who do you call when it's the sheriff setting your house on fire? When you have a very thin civil margin of guarantee, what Thurman is saying, you have to build your understanding of who you are, your foundation of security, on a different set of standards, values, and understandings. And that comes from within. Thurman argues that in these situations, you basically have three choices. I'm going to try to make this simple, even though there's nothing simple about it. First choice, admit you are living in an immoral and hostile world, and you are just doing whatever it takes to survive, and it doesn't matter whether it's right or wrong. The game is rigged from the start. Nothing that I do matters. There is no moral choice in this situation. There is no right thing. Thurman warns us that this is basically a lie. Just as Lawson stated and as Thurman believed, you always have a choice to be ethical, even in the face of great evil. The penalty, Thurman writes, if you don't recognize this as a lie, the penalty of such self-deception is to become a deception, with all sense of moral discrimination vindicated. You can act from a lie because nothing else matters. You're living in an immoral environment. But when you live from this place of deception, from this lie that there are no moral distinctions in our environment, therefore I don't have to be moral, you can tell yourself that you can do anything to another person because they've done anything they want to you. Sounds right to me. An eye for an eye. That's the way the world works. Okay. Second choice, compromise. You just go along to get along. You compromise everything to bow to your environment. You bend, you scrape, you get off the sidewalks, use so-called colored facilities, go to colored schools with out-of-date textbooks, no heat or air, live in segregated neighborhoods, houses rife with rats and roaches because it's better than the alternative. It's better than being dead. Life continuation, Thurman argues, for the disinherited becomes the only thing that matters in such highly oppressive environments. Morality, ethics, those are stupid conversations. You have to survive. That's what matters. As Thurman put it, it is not solely a question of keeping the body alive. It is rather how not to be killed. Not to be killed becomes the greatest end. Morality takes its meaning from that center. And unless that center is shifted, nothing real can be accomplished. This is the ultimate enclosure of an individual's spirit. Amid sweltering oppression, you lose any belief in your ability to do anything at all, to influence your surroundings. This is the ultimate capture. It is the final move in controlling people's bodies because you have snuffed out their internal life. You've taken their hope. That's why the Roman Empire lined the road to Rome with the crucified bodies of the state's enemies. It's why white supremacist terrorists bombed and burned out people's homes and lynched black Americans routinely in cold blood for public spectacle. You have no control here. You will do what we say when we say it, and any deviation from this social order will be met with violence and ultimately your death. Thurman says, fundamentally, both of these choices are based in lies, in deception. You always have ethical choices. What you do always matters. This is what Thurman said in his book. And you are lying to yourself when you say that only the survival of your body matters, that you must only do whatever it takes simply not to be killed. Thurman said there must be a larger, more transcendent goal. And that was especially important for people living as peoples of faith, which all of the students that I mentioned to you today were. Just look at the life of Jesus, Thurman said. Jesus stuck to his ethical ideals amid the most sweltering of all oppressive conditions. He literally adhered to his Jewish ethics until the moment of his death, forgiving his killers while he was hanging on the cross. So what's the third choice? Complete and devastating sincerity. This is the words that he uses. To be simply, directly truthful, whatever may be the cost in life, limb, security. For the individual who accepts this, there may be a quick and speedy judgment with attendant loss. But if the numbers increase, if the movement spreads, the vindication of truth will follow in the wake. There must always be the confidence that the effect of truthfulness can be realized in the mind of the oppressor as well as the oppressed, and there is no substitute for such faith. Thurman says sincerity might awaken within an oppressor a new sensibility, but more importantly, Thurman says that such truthfulness can be realized in the mind of the oppressed as well. That is where courage comes from. That is the internal awakening it requires to steel your soul. I can be who I was put on this earth to be because that is my truth, the truth of my own life. And the world desperately needs this truth. And I will have the courage to live that truth. Consequences be damned, because the world needs this so desperately. Thurman writes, in the presence of an overwhelming sincerity on the part of the disinherited, the dominant themselves are caught with no defense. The edge is taken away from the sense of prerogative, and from that status upon which the impregnability of their own position rests, they are thrown back from themselves onto themselves to reevaluate. Moral jujitsu is how some writers have described that. a leveling of the playing field, an opportunity to powerfully influence your own environment in an ethical way that is available to anyone at any time if we can be brave and creative enough to imagine it so. There is a stunning example of this sincerity in action from Reverend Lawson. He called me after the book came out and he said, I want to tell you the story about that picture. He said, I remember exactly when I was arrested, what I was doing, what I was reading. This was not the first time that he was arrested during the sit-in movement. On Big Saturday in February of 1960, he led columns of students to the downtown lunch counters, and they were going to sit in and attest to their own freedom and challenge segregation. But before they could get there, Solomon Gort, one of the students, is pulled out of line by a group of white toughs, and immediately they set upon to beating him, brutally. Reverend Lawson notices what's happening. He approaches the melee and attempts to communicate with one of the individuals. He notices he's wearing a leather jacket. And he says, excuse me, sir, do you have a hot rod or a motorcycle? And the guy looks up at him for a moment. He stops beating Solomon Gort. And he says, I have a hot rod. And he says, Lawson says to him, well, is it modified? He said, it is modified. He said, well, what kind of engine do you have in it? He says, well, I've got a 480. He said, it used to have this other engine, and before you know it, they're having this conversation. And long enough to pull Solomon Gort up and get him back in line and march downtown to the lunch counters. Thurman writes, instead of relation between the weak and the strong, there is merely a relationship between human beings. A person is a person, no more, no less. This awareness marks the supreme moment of human dignity. Will suffering flow if you decide to be utterly sincere, to try to find those moments? You bet. But for Lawson, suffering was central to the process of social change. Gandhi was assassinated. Jesus was assassinated. Later, King was assassinated in this very city that I know many of us love so much. And yet, through each of those individuals, an example endured. Ideals survived. And here we are talking about their influence today. Perhaps there is something more important than our own lives. The survival of an ideal and ethic which might only come through death. It may be argued, Thurman writes, that a man who places so high a price upon physical existence and survival that he is willing to purge his own soul has a false, or at least inadequate, sense of values. We cannot, we should not allow our environment to shape our moral and ethical sensibilities. To do so is to give in to the immoral social setting and to let go of our most deeply held values. So what of today? How do we respond to the constant threat of political violence, voters being attacked just this week, ballot boxes blown up, real questions about the peaceful transfer of power in this country? We live in a country founded on a violent revolution. Never forget that. But we also live in a nation founded on the ideals of freedom and equality. Liberty, equality, brotherhood, fraternity. As imperfect as we were at that time, and Lord knows we were imperfect, millions of enslaved Africans, fueling what would become the most powerful economic force in the history of the world. And as imperfect as we remain now, those radical ideals resound forward through the centuries, and they call to us today. Can we be free together? Can we continue this most audacious experiment of building and sustaining a pluralistic, interracial, interfaith, multicultural democracy, the most diverse in the history of human civilization? If it is to be so, we cannot lie to ourselves and we cannot lie to each other. We have to be devastatingly sincere in clinging to our most deeply held ethical convictions. We cannot become like our oppressive political environment. We cannot abandon our convictions to do the right thing. We cannot lie to ourselves. Our lives do matter. We can act ethically, and even our most simple choices can have a profound impact on this world. Thurman would tell us today, I think, do not allow the lies of this social order to infiltrate your inner life, that which is most sacred to you. This may feel incredibly unsatisfying right now for those of us who just want to win. We want to win. The election, the Supreme Court case, the vote to fund our programs at City Council or at the school board. And it was frustrating for people in Thurman's time because he gave them these quizzical, completely unsatisfying responses to the most pressing matters of the day. W.E.B. Du Bois, the 20th century's most prominent black intellectual, said, "What Howard Thurman believes, I have never been able to find out." That tickled me too. People called him a mystic, not only because he does not give you a satisfying and clear answer on many things, but also because, and this is just me talking, I think people often did not like Thurman's answers. But what Thurman said then is clear to me now. We should not lie to ourselves, and we should not lie to others. We should not allow the lies about ourselves or others to turn people into things, objects, stuff that we simply use in our effort to win. Objects we step on in our path to victory and discard when we are done. Because if we do that, we have already lost. Can we peel away the scales from our eyes to see the human beings before us, suffering in their own way, striving in their own world, and yearning in their own spirit to be free, just like us? Can we achieve that supreme moment of human dignity? I don't know. But I do know we can live that question every day and in every way and abandon the deception that Howard Thurman believed was at the heart of oppression. I believe the students in Nashville, the courageous students who transformed this country in the 1960s, I believe they learned that lesson. They put that question into practice in the way they lived their lives, and many of them lost their lives as a result, but the ideal persisted. We've got to let go of the lies we tell about ourselves and each other, or relinquish our own freedom. I think that's what Howard Thurman would say. Thank you.